The House Oversight Committee chamber was filled to capacity that Tuesday afternoon in Washington, D.C. C-SPAN cameras were live, documenting every tense moment as former housing secretary and renowned neurosurgeon Dr. Ben Carson took his seat at the witness table. His calm and composed appearance masked what would soon become one of the most talked-about political exchanges of the year. Across from him sat Representative Jasmine Crockett of Texas, adjusting her microphone, her expression focused and determined. What unfolded next would leave Carson momentarily speechless and dominate social media for weeks. In under 30 seconds, Crockett would completely turn the narrative Carson had built, challenging ideas of education, expertise, and who truly understands the struggles of everyday Americans. "Dr. Carson," Crockett began, her voice measured yet sharp, "you've questioned my educational background and suggested I'm not qualified to discuss housing policy. But there's one fact you seem to have overlooked. And when I share it, everyone here will see who's really out of touch." The room fell silent. Carson's faint smile started to fade. Committee members leaned forward in anticipation. What Crockett said next would become the most viewed congressional moment of the month, amassing over 50 million views in just 2 days. Before diving into that explosive exchange, hit the like button and subscribe to stay updated on the defining political moments shaping our nation's future. Comment below and tell us where you're watching from. Let's see how far this story travels. To grasp why this moment hit so hard, it's important to understand who these two figures are and what brought them to this heated face-off. Dr. Ben Carson, a legendary neurosurgeon celebrated for performing the first successful separation of conjoined twins joined at the head, built his political career around his medical expertise and inspirational life story. Growing up in poverty in Detroit, Carson overcame incredible challenges to become one of America's most respected surgeons. His soft-spoken demeanor earned him admiration across party lines, and when he became Secretary of Housing and Urban Development under President Trump, many saw it as a fitting role. A man who had experienced poverty now leading the department addressing it. But that narrative had cracks. Despite his medical genius, Carson had no prior experience in housing policy. His time at HUD was marked by controversy, from a $31,000 dining set purchase to proposals that would have tripled rent for low-income tenants. Critics argued that Carson, though once a symbol of perseverance, had grown distant from the communities he once represented. On the other side sat Representative Jasmine Crockett, a first-term congresswoman from Texas who had quickly established herself as one of Congress's most skilled interrogators. At 42, Crockett brought a different kind of expertise. She wasn't a doctor or academic, but a former public defender and civil rights attorney who spent years fighting for clients unable to afford legal counsel. She had witnessed firsthand how housing policies affected families struggling to stay afloat. Crockett didn't come from privilege or have elite titles, but she had real-world experience, years spent fighting evictions and learning housing law through lived practice, not theory. The tension between them had been brewing for weeks. Carson had made dismissive remarks during a conservative podcast, criticizing young progressives who don't understand housing markets. Though he never named her, everyone knew who he meant. Crockett had been one of his toughest critics, pressing him about HUD's failures to address the worsening housing crisis. But what truly ignited this clash was a tweet Carson posted just 3 days before the hearing. Some members of Congress would benefit from realizing that running government programs takes more than good intentions. Education and experience matter. The message was unmistakable, a jab at Crockett and other younger lawmakers questioning his record. It was the classic establishment tactic, using credentials as a shield to silence new voices. What Carson didn't realize was that he had set the perfect trap for himself. The hearing, officially about HUD's upcoming budget, was supposed to be routine, but everyone in that room knew it wouldn't be. Cameras were ready, journalists alert, and social media teams waiting to clip every word. When the hearing began, Carson delivered his opening remarks with his trademark calm. He spoke of fiscal responsibility, self-reliance, and reducing government dependency, familiar talking points his supporters expected. But Crockett wasn't jotting notes. She was waiting for her moment. Her team had done thorough research, calling sources, digging through archives, uncovering details Carson probably assumed were long forgotten. What they found would completely undercut his argument about qualifications. This was more than a political exchange. It was about who gets to represent struggling Americans. Does expertise come from degrees and titles, or from direct experience with the problems themselves? Do we prioritize the established elite or amplify new voices with real-world insight? The first hour went as expected. Members lobbed easy questions. Carson answered smoothly, occasionally using medical metaphors, diagnosing the housing crisis, or applying surgical precision to budget cuts. He seemed at ease, sailing through another hearing. Then came Crockett's turn. "Dr. Carson," she began, her tone slicing through the room's monotony. "I'd like to talk about qualifications." Carson adjusted his posture, a polite smile forming. He'd handled dozens of exchanges like this before. "Please, Congresswoman," he said, his tone lightly patronizing. "Go ahead. You've said recently that understanding housing policy requires proper education and experience," Crockett continued. "You've implied that members like myself lack those qualifications." "I simply believe complex policy requires complex understanding," Carson replied smoothly. "My medical training taught me to analyze systems, how different parts work together. That's the perspective I bring to HUD." "Your medical training," Crockett repeated. "Let's discuss that. You're a neurosurgeon, correct?" "Yes," Carson answered proudly. "I served as director of pediatric neurosurgery at Johns Hopkins for many years." "Impressive," Crockett nodded. "And that makes you an expert on housing policy because—" Carson hesitated slightly. "Because it taught me to approach complex issues systematically. To perform brain surgery," Crockett interjected. "It taught you how to perform brain surgery. Remarkable, truly." "But Dr. Carson, when was the last time you personally faced an eviction notice?" The room went still. Phones were lowered. Heads turned. "I don't see how that's relevant," Carson began. "When was the last time you sat across from a family losing their home?" Crockett pressed. "When did you last negotiate with a landlord over an illegally withheld security deposit? Or file a HUD complaint, not as the secretary, but as someone actually seeking help?" "Congresswoman, my experience—" "Your experience," Crockett cut in firmly, "is in neurosurgery." "That's impressive when it comes to operating on brains, Dr. Carson, but it doesn't necessarily translate to understanding housing markets. Since you mentioned education, let's discuss it." Crockett opened a folder on her desk as Carson's advisors exchanged uneasy looks. In hearings like this, a folder usually means bad news for the witness. "You earned your medical degree from the University of Michigan Medical School," Crockett began, reading from her notes. "Graduated in 1977, then completed your residency at Johns Hopkins, all very prestigious." "Yes, that's correct," Carson replied cautiously, unsure where the questioning was headed. "And before that, you got your undergraduate degree from Yale in psychology, class of 1973. Impressive schools, really," Crockett continued. "But Dr. Carson, as I reviewed your educational background, I couldn't find something. Maybe you can clarify." She paused briefly. Cameras zoomed in, anticipating the next line. "Where did you study housing policy?" Crockett asked. "Urban planning, economics, public administration, real estate law?" "In what field did you gain expertise related to managing the Department of Housing and Urban Development?" Carson shifted in his chair. "Well, leadership skills are transferable." "That's not what I asked," Crockett interrupted firmly. "You've implied education is essential to understanding housing policy, so where's yours in this area?" "My experience as secretary." "You mean the job you were given without prior housing experience?" she pressed. Crockett leaned forward. "Dr. Carson, you want to discuss education?" "Let's." "I hold a bachelor's degree in business administration and a law degree from Howard University School of Law. I spent 10 years practicing law, specifically in housing discrimination, eviction defense, and civil rights issues in public housing." She continued, her tone steady but pointed. "I've personally represented more than 200 families facing eviction. I've filed more HUD complaints than you've likely reviewed during your tenure. I've been inside the apartments your policies affect. I've seen the mold, the broken heaters, the landlords who ignore repairs. So when we talk about qualifications and education, tell me, who's more qualified to discuss housing policy? The neurosurgeon who's never studied it, or the lawyer who's lived it every day? The room fell silent. Carson's calm demeanor began to fade, but Crockett wasn't done. And here's something even more interesting, she continued in a measured tone. While preparing for this hearing, I found something about your own housing history that deserves attention. Carson's advisors whispered urgently, but he motioned them away, trying to maintain composure. You've built a narrative about hard work and education lifting you from poverty. Admirable, truly, Crockett said. But there's a part of your story you rarely mention. She lifted another document from her folder. Cameras clicked as reporters leaned forward. Dr. Carson, isn't it true your family received government assistance growing up? Carson's jaw tightened. Many families in Detroit. That's not what I asked. Did your family receive government assistance? Yes or no? After a pause, Carson replied quietly, yes. Specifically, Crockett continued, reading from her file, your family received food stamps. You lived in public housing. You benefited from programs designed to help struggling families, the same ones you're now proposing to cut. The room stirred as reporters began typing. Committee members whispered to aides. Wait, Crockett said, regaining control. There's more, and this part really highlights the inconsistency in your position. She held up another document. These are Yale University financial aid records. Dr. Carson, isn't it true you received need-based aid, including government-backed student loans and grants, to attend Yale? Without them, you wouldn't have afforded that Ivy League education you often reference. Carson's expression hardened. I worked hard for everything I achieved. No one disputes that, Crockett replied evenly. But you didn't do it alone. You had help. Government help. The same kind of help you now want to limit for others. You climbed the ladder, Dr. Carson, and now you're trying to pull it up behind you. She sat back, letting her words settle. So when you question my qualifications, or my understanding of housing policy, remember this. I studied the law governing housing. You studied the brain. I defended families facing eviction. You performed surgeries. I worked within the system you oversee. You benefited from that very system. She looked directly at him. So, tell me again, Dr. Carson, which one of us is really qualified to speak about housing policy? The silence was heavy. Carson opened his mouth but struggled to find words. For a man who had performed intricate surgeries, he couldn't seem to separate himself from the argument Crockett had constructed. Finally he spoke. Congresswoman, I think you're mischaracterizing. Am I? Crockett cut in sharply. Which part? That you received assistance? That you attended Yale on financial aid? That you never studied housing policy? Or that you're cutting the same programs that once supported you? Please, Dr. Carson, tell me which part is wrong. Carson tried to pivot. My personal experience with poverty makes me more qualified. Your personal experience with poverty, Crockett interrupted, was 40 years ago. You haven't experienced poverty since the 1970s, Dr. Carson. Do you know what's changed since then? Everything. Housing costs have skyrocketed, wages haven't kept pace, and the very programs that once helped families like yours have been stripped down. You're trying to use 1970s solutions for 2024 problems, and it's simply not working. Crockett picked up another document, and Carson shifted uneasily. By now, everyone in the room understood that whenever she reached for a paper, something significant was coming. Let's discuss your record at HUD, she said. You've served as secretary for several years now, so let's look at the results. Under your leadership, HUD proposed tripling rent for the poorest public housing residents. You've cut funding for homeless veterans and reduced support for housing discrimination investigations. And my personal favorite, she continued, you Authorize spending $31,000 on a dining set for your office, while simultaneously reducing budgets for public housing maintenance. That dining set issue was, Carson began. $31,000, Crockett repeated clearly. Do you know how many families I've represented who could have avoided eviction with that amount? How many security deposits it could have covered? How many months of rent it could have provided for struggling families? But instead, that money went toward new furniture. Then, breaking from usual hearing decorum, she pulled out her phone. I want to show you something, Dr. Carson. This is a video from last week. Mrs. Patricia Williams, 67 years old, disabled, living on a fixed income in Houston, Texas. She's being evicted from her public housing unit due to a HUD policy change, one you implemented. She has nowhere to go. Would you like to see it? Carson's attorneys immediately stood and began whispering. One interjected, Congresswoman, I don't think this is appropriate for... Oh, now you want to talk about what's appropriate? Crockett cut in, directing her response at the lawyer. Was it appropriate when your client questioned my qualifications? Was it appropriate when he used his position to belittle younger members of Congress? Sit down, counselor. Your client wanted to talk about education and expertise. We're going to finish that discussion. The attorney quietly took his seat, recognizing he couldn't win this exchange. Crockett turned back to Carson. You know your problem, Dr. Carson? You believe that because you escaped poverty, everyone else should be able to do the same. You assume that because you became a neurosurgeon, those who struggle simply aren't working hard enough. But here's the truth. The ladder you climbed doesn't exist anymore. You removed it. She stood, taking a few steps closer, still maintaining professional distance. Do you want to know what actual expertise in housing policy looks like? It's knowing that the average family must earn at least $22 an hour to afford a 2-bedroom apartment at fair market rent. It's understanding that in no state can a minimum wage worker afford that same apartment. It's recognizing that our nation faces a shortage of 7 million affordable housing units for extremely low-income families. The room was completely silent as she continued, calm but unwavering. Real expertise, she said, is knowing that eviction filings have risen by 20% in the past 5 years. It's understanding that most Americans are one medical emergency away from losing their homes. It's acknowledging that housing discrimination still persists, even though it's illegal, and that HUD's mission is to fight it, not allow it to continue. Crockett returned to her seat but remained standing. You know what the most important qualification is, Dr. Carson? She asked. It's caring about the people impacted by these policies. It's remembering your roots. It's using your success to lift others up, not to remove the ladder once you've climbed it. She picked up one final document. This is a letter from the National Low-Income Housing Coalition, she said. They've evaluated every HUD secretary over the past 30 years based on their effectiveness in addressing the affordable housing crisis. Would you like to know where you rank? Carson stayed silent, but the quiet said enough. Dead last, Crockett stated evenly. The neurosurgeon with all the prestigious degrees, the man who questions others' qualifications, is rated as the least effective HUD secretary in modern history. Not because you lack intelligence, everyone knows you're brilliant, but because you've lost touch. You've forgotten what it feels like to need help, to be desperate. You've forgotten that not everyone can become a neurosurgeon, but everyone deserves a roof over their head. Then came the question that would define the moment. So I have one more question for you, Dr. Carson, Crockett said, her voice calm but steady enough to command the room. And I want you to think carefully before answering, because the entire country is watching. If education and qualifications are so essential for understanding housing policy, if your Yale degree and medical background make you uniquely suited to lead HUD, then why are you performing so poorly at it? The room reacted instantly. Committee members stopped pretending to maintain order. Reporters gasped. The gallery broke into murmurs and applause. The committee chair banged his gavel repeatedly, but the moment had already gone viral. The clip was being recorded, uploaded, and shared in real time. Carson sat motionless. The composure that had carried him through 30-hour surgeries and political campaigns was gone. He looked defeated, not from insults, but from facts and his own record. He tried to recover. Congresswoman Crockett, I respect your passion, but no, you don't, she interrupted. You don't respect anything about me. If you did, you wouldn't have questioned my qualifications. You wouldn't have implied that I don't belong here, and you wouldn't use your degrees as weapons to silence others. She leaned forward slightly. But here's the truth, Dr. Carson. I do belong here. I belong here because I've lived through housing insecurity, because I've defended families facing eviction, because I studied the laws that shape housing policy, and most importantly, because the people elected me to be here, to speak for them, to fight for them, and to challenge those who've forgotten what struggle looks like. Crockett sat down, calmly folding her hands. I yield the balance of my time, she said. The chair, still trying to restore order, finally called for a 5-minute recess. Carson immediately stood, surrounded by his staff as they exited the room. But the damage was irreversible. In less than 20 minutes, Jasmine Crockett had dismantled not only Carson's arguments, but his entire public image. As others filed out for the break, she remained seated, quietly organizing her papers. Her aides approached, clearly elated, but she stayed composed. She knew the weight of what had just occurred. She hadn't relied on outrage or theatrics. She'd relied on facts, preparation and credibility earned from lived experience. Within minutes, the clip was everywhere. Twitter, now called X, was flooded with hashtags. Crockett destroys Carson. Judge HUD fail. Qualifications matter. The video spread across the platform at lightning speed. Political shows pivoted instantly. On MSNBC, Rachel Maddow interrupted her scheduled segment to air the footage. What you just witnessed, she told viewers, wasn't just a hearing. It was a full dismantling of a long-standing political narrative about expertise and who truly represents working Americans. Even on Fox News, where Carson often found support, hosts struggled to defend him. Look, Carson walked into that one commentator admitted. You can't question someone's qualifications and then fail to defend your own. Crockett came prepared, and he didn't see it coming. But the real storm was online. The clip was analyzed frame by frame. Users created compilations of Carson's reactions as Crockett revealed each fact. Memes circulated instantly. One showed Carson's stunned face with the caption, "When the person you called unqualified ends your career." Progressive viewers hailed Crockett as a new kind of political force. One viral post read, "This is what we need more of. Leaders who don't just sit back, but show up with evidence and courage." And perhaps most notably, conservative commentators who typically defended Carson stayed silent. Some commentators, even among Carson's usual defenders, quietly admitted that Crockett had made strong points. "I don't share her politics," one conservative blogger wrote, "but she completely outmatched Carson on the qualifications issue. He should never have gone down that path." Within hours, Crockett's office released a statement, short but impactful. "Today's exchange wasn't about me versus Dr. Carson," it read. "It was about who we trust to shape policies that affect millions of Americans. Do we listen to those with elite credentials, but no real-world understanding? Or to those who've lived and worked in the realities these policies impact? Do we value titles over practical experience? Do we admire those who rise up only to pull the ladder up behind them? Or those who fight to ensure everyone gets a fair chance to climb? The American people deserve leaders who remember where they came from and who they're here to serve." Carson's office also issued a statement, but it came across as defensive and failed to connect. "Dr. Carson's record speaks for itself," it read. "He remains committed to fiscally responsible policies that empower communities instead of fostering dependency." Online, the reaction was immediate and harsh. "His record does speak for itself," one user posted. "It says he's the worst HUD secretary in 3 decades. As the day unfolded, the situation grew worse for Carson. Motivated by Crockett's remarks, journalists began reviewing his record at HUD, uncovering more examples of unnecessary spending, deeper proposed cuts to essential programs, and repeated signs of disconnect from the communities he served. A particularly damaging account came from a former HUD staffer, who claimed Carson once asked during a meeting if they could simply sell public housing to private developers, seemingly unaware that people actually live there. "He talked about those properties like they were just numbers on a spreadsheet," the employee said. Politically, the fallout was swift and far-reaching. Younger progressives in Congress began adopting Crockett's approach, coming to hearings thoroughly prepared and ready to challenge dismissive attitudes from senior politicians. The days of quietly accepting condescension are over, one freshman representative said. Jasmine showed us what effective accountability looks like. More importantly, the confrontation ignited a national debate on the meaning of expertise and representation. Opinion pieces questioned whether traditional credentials truly mattered in politics, or whether lived experience and relevant education should carry greater weight. Carson is unquestionably gifted in his profession, a Washington Post columnist noted, but his profession is in housing. Crockett exposed a central flaw in our system. We often award authority based on prestige, not on actual subject knowledge. The video of the exchange continued to spread globally. The BBC aired a segment calling it a masterclass in political precision, while The Guardian described it as a symbol of a generational shift in American politics. Even politicians abroad were reportedly studying Crockett's preparation and delivery. Back in Washington, the ripple effects were beginning to influence real policy discussions. Several Republican senators who had previously supported Carson's budget proposal suddenly appeared less committed. "We need to re-examine these numbers," one senator said cautiously when asked about the HUD budget. The political leverage Carson needed to advance his proposed cuts had evaporated within just 20 minutes of questioning. Democratic leaders, while careful not to appear celebratory, were clearly pleased. Speaking to reporters, Nancy Pelosi said, "Congresswoman Crockett demonstrated what we've long believed, that expertise comes in many forms. Those who've lived the issues we debate deserve not only a place at the table, but genuine respect when they speak." But it was the reaction from everyday Americans that truly stood out. Crockett's office received thousands of calls and emails from citizens sharing their personal housing struggles, many thanking her for giving them a voice. One viral video showed public housing residents in Baltimore watching the exchange on a phone, cheering as Crockett asked her final question. "She said what we've all been thinking," one resident remarked. "The people making decisions about our lives often have no idea what our lives are like." A week later, the full impact became clear. Carson canceled several public appearances, citing scheduling conflicts. When he did appear, he seemed subdued and far less confident. The confident authority that once defined him had disappeared. Politically, his influence was effectively neutralized. Crockett, on the other hand, had become a national figure. She appeared on every major news outlet, her social media following surged, and talk of higher office began circulating. Yet she stayed grounded in her message. "This isn't about me," she told one interviewer. "It's about ensuring that the people making housing decisions understand what it means to actually need housing assistance. It's about making sure that those of us with different experiences aren't dismissed simply because we didn't go to Ivy League schools or don't have medical degrees." She paused, then added with a smile, "For the record, Howard University, where I earned my law degree, is an excellent school. Maybe not Yale, but clearly Yale didn't teach Dr. Carson much about housing policy." The moment carried broader implications for American politics. It proved that using academic credentials as a weapon no longer worked, especially when those credentials weren't relevant. It also showed that younger lawmakers were no longer willing to accept condescension from their elders. They were coming armed with facts, evidence, and confidence. Political science professors quickly began adding the exchange to their courses as an example of effective political communication. "What Crockett did was textbook," one professor explained. "She stayed calm, avoided personal attacks, and methodically dismantled her opponent's logic using his own arguments against him. It was a masterclass in political precision." The confrontation also exposed a deeper divide in American politics, not just between left and right, but between those who had once struggled and still empathized with that experience, and those who had risen above it and forgotten. Carson symbolized the latter, someone who had overcome poverty, but now treated it as a moral failure rather than a systemic challenge. Crockett represented the former, someone who had achieved success while remaining connected to those still fighting for opportunity. 3 weeks after the hearing, a national poll showed HUD's approval ratings had dropped to record lows, while public awareness of housing issues had risen sharply. Americans were now openly discussing affordable housing, the role of government assistance, and the value of leaders who truly understood their constituents' realities. Carson never fully recovered. Though he stayed in his position for several months, his influence waned. His proposed budgets were shelved, his public presence faded, and he carefully avoided discussing education or qualifications. Having learned those arguments could be easily turned against him. The greater legacy, however, was the shift in political strategy. The Crockett method, as analysts began calling it, became a new model for responding to condescension and elitism. The rules were simple. Come armed with facts, understand your opponent's weaknesses, remain composed, and turn their own logic against them. Young politicians, especially women and people of color who had often been dismissed, studied the hearing closely. They learned that respect didn't have to be demanded through anger, but earned through preparation and intelligence. Months later, in a podcast interview, Crockett reflected on the event. "I didn't go into that hearing trying to destroy anyone," she said. "But when someone questions your right to be in the room, when they imply you don't belong because you lack the right background, you have two choices. You can accept their standards, or you can challenge them and show that their standards are the real problem. I chose the second option." She continued, "Dr. Carson is a brilliant neurosurgeon. No one can take that away from him. But brilliance in one field doesn't mean expertise in another. And escaping poverty doesn't give you the right to make it harder for others to escape it. That's not leadership. That's selfishness." When asked if she regretted how harshly the exchange affected Carson, Crockett replied, "I regret that it had to happen, but not that I defended myself and my constituents. Dr. Carson made it about qualifications. He suggested some of us don't belong here. He opened that door. I just walked through it, with the facts." As the one-year anniversary approached, the event had become part of political history. Documentaries were being made, books written, and the phrase "pulling a Crockett" had entered the political vocabulary, meaning to thoroughly prepare and dismantle an opponent with facts instead of theatrics. On Capitol Hill, staffers studied the exchange as a training model. Campaign strategists shifted their focus toward exposing contradictions rather than personal scandals. More importantly, Americans began rethinking what it truly meant to be qualified. Was it elite education or lived experience? Prestige or empathy? These questions had no easy answers, but the fact they were being asked showed a cultural transformation in how leadership was perceived. All of it began with one congresswoman refusing to accept disrespect, doing her homework and asking one powerful question. "If you're so qualified, why are you so bad at your job?" That moment changed everything. It signaled that the next generation of leaders would not quietly stay in the background. They would come prepared, with facts, confidence, and purpose, to challenge the old hierarchies. As we look back, it stands as a turning point in modern politics. When preparation defeated arrogance, when lived experience proved more valuable than empty credentials, and when Jasmine Crockett didn't just defend herself, she reshaped the conversation about who gets to lead and who deserves to be heard. The takeaway is simple. Never underestimate someone because they don't fit the traditional mold. They might just have the facts that dismantle your entire argument. And in today's world, that moment will be captured, shared, and remembered forever. As Carson learned the hard way, and as Crockett showed the nation, it's not about the degrees on your wall. It's about the facts in your folder and the people in your heart. And when someone brings both, they're unstoppable. If you found this breakdown of one of the most defining political exchanges of our time insightful, make sure to like, share, and subscribe. We analyze pivotal moments in American politics every week, offering clarity, context, and deeper understanding you won't find anywhere else. Drop a comment below. Did Crockett go too far, or was it exactly what was needed? And which political moments should we analyze next? Don't forget to hit the notification bell so you never miss our future videos, including next week's deep dive into another congressional hearing that caught everyone off guard. Share this with anyone who wants to understand how American politics is truly evolving. And remember, in politics, as in life, Preparation beats pedigree every single time. Stay informed, stay engaged, and never let anyone convince you that you don't belong in the room, because you just might be the one with the facts that change everything.